Eleanor Whitmore counted the coins in her palm for the third time, and they still did not feel like enough courage to do what she was about to do. The coaching inn was loud with strangers, thick with smoke and the smell of wet wool, and somewhere in that crowd was a man she needed to convince to marry her by morning. She had 3 days left, 3 days before her grandfather closed his eyes for the last time, and with him would go the only home she had ever known. The solicitor had been clear. The estate would pass to her cousin Gerald unless she was a married woman when her grandfather died. Gerald, who had already measured the curtains for his own taste. Gerald, who called her an old maid to her face and smiled while he said it. She did not have a suitor. She had never had time for one. Not while nursing her grandfather through 2 long winters. What she had was a plan so foolish, it frightened her more than poverty did. A man sat alone near the fire, a tankard untouched in front of him, his coat too fine for this room, and his eyes too tired for his age. He did not look like the other travelers, loud with drink and easy laughter. He looked like a man waiting for something he did not want to arrive. Eleanor walked to him before she could talk herself out of it. "I have a proposal," she said, "and I will pay you for it." He looked up slowly. His eyes were a gray that reminded her of storm clouds before the rain finally breaks. "I am not for sale," he said, though there was no anger in it, only weariness. "Not for sale. For hire. 1 night only." She sat down across from him without being asked, because asking would have given her time to lose her nerve. "My grandfather is dying. His last wish is to see me married. If you stand beside me tomorrow and speak the words a husband speaks, I will pay you everything I have. Afterward, you will never see me again." He studied her, the way a man studies a puzzle he does not expect to solve. "You are asking a stranger to lie to a dying man." "I am asking a stranger to give a dying man peace," she said. "There is a difference." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick as a candle flickering in a draft. "What is your name?" "Eleanor Whitmore." "And you know nothing about me." "I know you have kind eyes and a tired face, and that is more than most brides know about their husbands," she said, and to her surprise, he almost smiled. "There will be conditions," he said. "You will not ask my name, beyond what I give you. You will not ask where I come from, or where I go after tomorrow. This is a performance, nothing more, and when the curtain falls, it falls completely." "Agreed," she said, though a small voice inside her wondered why a man would guard his name so carefully if he had nothing to hide. "You have not asked how much I am offering," Eleanor said, surprised by his quick agreement. "Would it change my answer?" "I hoped it might make you take me seriously." "I take a woman seriously the moment she sits down across from a stranger in a room full of drunken travelers and asks him to lie for her," he said. "Money is simply the detail that decides whether I say yes." She counted the coins onto the table between them, feeling foolish at how small the pile looked once it left her hand. It was every shilling she had saved, from 3 years of teaching other people's children their letters. Money meant to carry her through whatever came after her grandfather's death, whether that meant a room to rent or a coach fare to somewhere new. She was gambling all of it on a stranger's willingness to stand beside her for a single hour. "It is not much," she admitted. "It is enough," Adrian said, and something in the way he said it made her wonder, briefly, whether he needed the money at all, or whether some other reason entirely had made him agree so readily. She did not ask. Their bargain, after all, forbade questions, and she had only just made it. He held out his hand, and she shook it, and the bargain was made. Before they parted that evening, Eleanor hurried to the vicarage on the edge of the village, her hands still trembling from the bargain she had just struck. The vicar, Mr. Pemberton, was an elderly man who had baptized Eleanor herself as an infant and had watched her grow beneath her grandfather's careful guidance ever since. He listened to her request with visible surprise, his bushy eyebrows rising toward his hairline. "A wedding tomorrow, with no banns read and no notice given? Eleanor, this is highly irregular." "My grandfather is dying, Mr. Pemberton. He may not live to see another sunrise. I am asking only for a small blessing, so that he may pass believing me settled and safe. Surely such mercy is worth a little irregularity." The old vicar studied her for a long moment, weighing the request against a lifetime of careful order. and finally sighed with the resignation of a man who had never learned to refuse a request made with tears standing in someone's eyes. Bring your intended to the cottage at first light. I will do what I can within what is proper, though I cannot promise the bishop will approve of the haste, should he ever hear of it. Eleanor thanked him with such relief that she nearly wept a second time that night, and hurried back through the darkening streets toward the inn, uncertain, even then, whether the stranger she had bargained with would still be waiting. He gave her only one name that night, Adrian, nothing more, and she did not press him, though she noticed the innkeeper's wife went pale when she caught sight of him crossing the yard, and crossed herself the moment he was out of sight. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the small window of the room she had rented above the inn, watching the road below, and thought of the man she had left downstairs with her savings folded into his coat pocket. She wondered if he would still be there in the morning, or whether he would simply vanish with her money and leave her to face her grandfather's final hours with nothing but a broken promise to carry. She had gambled everything on the honesty of a stranger's tired eyes, and as the candle burned low, she began to fear it had been the greatest foolishness of her life. Her grandfather had raised her since she was 6 years old, after a fever took both her parents within the same terrible week. He had been a stern man in his younger years, a former soldier who did not believe in coddling a grieving child, but the sternness had softened over the decades into something Eleanor treasured more than she could ever put into words. He had taught her to read from his own worn Bible, had walked 3 miles each way so she could attend the village school, and had never once, in all the years since, made her feel like a burden he had not chosen. The cottage was small, but it had always felt like enough. Now, with Gerald's threats hanging over it like a storm cloud, even its modest walls felt like something worth fighting to keep. She had told her grandfather nothing of her plan, only that she had found someone, and prayed he would be too weak, too eager for happiness in his final days, to ask questions that might unravel the lie before it had a chance to bring him peace. The walk to the cottage that morning felt longer than any distance Eleanor had ever crossed before, though it was barely half a mile down a familiar lane lined with hedgerows just beginning to bud. Adrian walked beside her in silence, his borrowed calm a strange comfort against her own racing thoughts. Twice she nearly turned back, certain the whole plan would collapse the moment her grandfather looked too closely at the stranger beside her. And twice, Adrian's steady presence, unbothered and patient, kept her feet moving forward. "You are shaking," he observed quietly, as they neared the cottage gate. "I am terrified," Eleanor admitted. "What if he does not believe it?" "Then he will see, at the very least, that you tried to give him peace," Adrian said. "That alone is no small gift to offer a dying man." The next morning, Eleanor brought him to her grandfather's small cottage on the edge of the village, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it beside her. Her grandfather lay propped against thin pillows, his breathing shallow, his hands like paper over the quilt. When his eyes found Eleanor and the stranger beside her, they filled with a light she had not seen in weeks. "You did not tell me," he whispered, his voice cracking with joy. "You wicked girl, you did not tell me you had found someone." "I wanted it to be a surprise, grandfather," Eleanor said, and the lie tasted like ash and honey, both at once. Before the ceremony began, Adrian had paused at the cottage door, straightening his coat with unusual care, and Eleanor had caught, just for a moment, something like nervousness cross his composed features. "You need not do this so thoroughly," she whispered to him, misunderstanding the source of his hesitation. "A few kind words will satisfy him. You need not perform beyond what is necessary. I intend to give your grandfather a proper wedding to remember, whatever the circumstances that brought us to it," Adrian replied quietly. "A dying man deserves more than a hollow performance, even from a stranger." It was that answer, more than anything spoken before it, that first made Eleanor wonder whether she had misjudged the man entirely, whether the tired eyes across the tavern table had belonged to someone far gentler than his guarded manner first suggested. Adrian knelt beside the bed and took the old man's hand, as though he had done it 100 times before, as though this frail stranger mattered to him more than anything in the world. "Sir," he said, "I promise you I will care for her. You need not worry for her another day." There was such quiet conviction in his voice that Eleanor's breath caught. She had expected him to perform the role adequately, to say the correct words, and nothing more. She had not expected him to say them as though he meant every syllable. Her grandfather wept with happiness, and the local vicar, summoned that morning under the pretense of a hasty wedding blessing for a match too urgent to wait for banns, spoke the words over them both. Eleanor repeated her vows in a voice that trembled only slightly. Adrian's voice did not tremble at all, and that steadiness, more than anything, unsettled her. That night, her grandfather passed in his sleep, his hand still curled around hers, a smile resting on his face that had not been there in months. Eleanor wept until she had no tears left, and when she finally looked up, Adrian was still there, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, as though he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. "You can go now," she told him through her grief. "You did what I asked. I will bring your payment within the hour." "Keep your money," he said quietly. "Bury your grandfather first." She stared at him, confused by the kindness in a man who owed her nothing further. "Why would you stay? Our agreement is finished." Adrian did not answer at once. He looked toward the window, toward the gray morning light creeping over the hills, and something in his expression closed like a door. "Some agreements," he said, "are not so easily finished." Eleanor did not understand what he meant. Not then. She thought only of her grief, and of the strange comfort of not grieving entirely alone. She did not yet know that a village magistrate, an old friend of her grandfather's, had already ridden through the night to formally register the marriage in the parish book, eager to see the family name protected before Gerald could contest a deathbed union. She did not yet know that the man beside her was not a nameless traveler at all, but the most feared duke in England, and that the paper trail now binding their names together could not be undone with a simple goodbye. The performance she thought had ended was only just beginning. The magistrate arrived at the cottage before Eleanor had even changed out of her mourning black. Mr. Foley was a heavy-set man with a kind face and a habit of clearing his throat before delivering unwelcome news, and he cleared it twice before he spoke. "Your grandfather asked me, some weeks past, to see that his affairs were settled properly the moment you were wed," he said. "I have already recorded the marriage in the parish register. It is done, Mrs. Ashworth. Witnessed and legal." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Mr. Foley, there has been a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding in a signed register," he said gently. "Your cousin Gerald arrived not an hour after you left the church yesterday, asking sharp questions about the timing of the ceremony. He suspects trickery, and he is the sort of man who would drag a grieving widow through the courts to get what he wants. I made certain there was nothing left for him to contest." Adrian, standing near the doorway with his hat in his hands, went very still. "You recorded it as a true marriage." "It is a true marriage," Foley said, surprised. "You spoke your vows before a vicar and witnesses. There is no falseness in a ceremony properly performed, whatever private arrangement led you to the altar." Eleanor turned to Adrian, searching his face for panic to match her own, but found only a careful blankness, the look of a man recalculating a plan in complete silence. "You said this would end when the performance ended," she said quietly, so Foley would not hear the accusation in it. "I did not know he would do this," Adrian said. "I did not ask for it." "Then unmake it. Surely a man of your means can find a solicitor clever enough to undo a hasty signature." Something flickered across his face, quick as lightning, gone before she could name it. "It will take time," he said, "longer than a signature took to write." Foley, oblivious to the storm passing between them, clapped Adrian on the shoulder with the easy warmth of a man who believed he had done a good deed. "Take your bride home, sir. She has buried her grandfather. She should not spend her first days as a wife alone in a cold cottage, waiting for vultures like Gerald Whitmore to pick through what is left." Foley left soon after, satisfied with a task he believed he had done kindly, and Eleanor sat alone at the small kitchen table, where she had eaten 1,000 meals with her grandfather, trying to understand how quickly her life had folded itself into a shape she had never chosen. She had wanted one night, one brief performance to grant a dying man peace, and then a quiet return to whatever ordinary hardship waited for a woman alone in the world. Instead, she was a duchess, bound by law to a stranger, whose name she had learned only from a frightened innkeeper's wife, tied to a house she had never seen, and a title she had never wanted. Gerald arrived that same afternoon, his boots too polished for a house of mourning, his eyes already cataloging the furniture as though it might still somehow become his. When Foley's news reached him, his expression curdled from smug anticipation into open fury. You planned this, he hissed at Eleanor, careless of Adrian's presence in the doorway. You knew the old man was dying, and arranged a hasty wedding to cheat me out of what is rightfully mine. Nothing here was ever rightfully yours, Eleanor said, finding a steadiness in her voice she did not entirely feel. You have simply spent 3 years assuming it would be, and now you must accustom yourself to disappointment. Gerald's gaze slid toward Adrian, sizing him up with the particular cowardice of a bully who preferred easier targets. And who exactly is this sudden husband, dressed like a lord and appearing from nowhere at the perfect moment? Someone with far more patience than you deserve, Adrian said quietly, and something in his level, unhurried tone made Gerald take an involuntary step backward. He left soon after, muttering threats about solicitors and contested wills that Eleanor suspected, correctly, would come to nothing, though the venom in his voice lingered in the cottage long after his carriage had rattled away down the lane. There was nowhere else for Eleanor to go. Her cousin had already begun making arrangements to take the cottage, certain now that her marriage voided his claim to it, and certain, too, that he intended to make her regret every day of it. She had no family left to shelter her, no income beyond the small savings meant to pay a stranger for one night's work, savings that now felt useless in her hand. She spent her final hour in the cottage packing what little belonged to her, wrapping her grandfather's worn Bible carefully in a spare shawl, along with a small tin of buttons her mother had once kept, and a single pressed flower from a garden she barely remembered. Everything else, the furniture, the modest dishes, the faded curtains her grandfather had sewn himself after her grandmother's death, would remain behind for Gerald to claim, whatever satisfaction he found in it. Eleanor stood a long moment in the doorway before leaving, memorizing the small rooms that had held every year of her life she could clearly recall, and felt, despite the strangeness of the days behind her, a door quietly closing on a chapter she had not chosen to end so soon. Adrian offered his carriage without being asked twice, and she accepted only because the alternative was worse. The journey took 2 days, and for most of the first, Eleanor sat in silence, watching the countryside change from familiar hedgerows to unfamiliar stone walls, feeling more and more like a woman being carried toward a life she had never agreed to. Adrian said little, occupied with letters he wrote and sealed and did not explain, his expression unreadable behind the carriage window's reflection. It was the coachman who first gave her a clue to the truth. They stopped to change horses at a posting inn, and while Adrian went inside to arrange fresh mounts, the coachman, a weathered man named Barnaby, leaned down from his seat to speak to her. "You are new to His Grace's household, ma'am." "His Grace?" Eleanor repeated, certain she had misheard. Barnaby's face changed, a flicker of alarm passing over it, as though he had said something he should not have. "Forgive me. I assumed you knew. The gentleman inside is His Grace the Duke of Blackmore." He glanced toward the inn door, lowering his voice further. "Some folk hereabouts do not care for the name. Old stories, mostly. Nothing you need trouble yourself with." Eleanor's mouth went dry. What stories? But Barnaby had already straightened, his professional composure sliding back into place like a mask. "Not my place to say, ma'am. Best you ask His Grace himself." She did not have the chance before Adrian returned, climbing back into the carriage with the same quiet reserve he had worn the entire journey. She studied him now with new eyes, searching for some sign of the danger the coachman's face had betrayed, some hint of the reputation that made grown men lower their voices at the mention of his name. She found nothing but tired gray eyes and a jaw held too tightly, as though he were bracing for a blow only he could see coming. "You lied to me," she said at last, unable to hold the silence any longer. "I never lied," he said. "I told you my name was Adrian. It is. You let me believe you were a nameless traveler, a man with nothing to his name but a tired face and an empty tankard. I never claimed to be nameless. You never asked further, and I did not offer." His voice was even, but there was something beneath it, a wariness that had not been there in the tavern, as though he had been waiting for this conversation, with the same dread other men reserve for a physician's diagnosis. "They call you dreaded," Eleanor said. The coachman would not even speak the stories aloud. Adrian looked out the window for a long moment before he answered. "There are stories about me in every parlor between London and the border, Mrs. Ashworth. Very few of them are true, and I have long since stopped correcting the ones that are not. You are welcome to believe whichever version frightens you least." That is no answer. It is the only one I have to give tonight, he said, and turned back to his letters, and Eleanor understood that whatever waited for her at the end of this road, she would have to discover it for herself, one carefully guarded silence at a time. They stopped for the night at a second inn, smaller and quieter than the first, and Adrian secured 2 separate rooms without being asked, a small courtesy that Eleanor noticed and did not mention, though it eased some of the tightness that had settled in her chest since Barnaby's careless slip of the tongue. Over a simple supper of bread and stew, she studied him across the table, searching for the dread the villagers seemed so certain he deserved. "You do not eat like a monster," she said finally, breaking the silence between them. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "How does a monster eat?" "Less politely, I should think, with more growling." "I will try to disappoint you less thoroughly tomorrow," he said, and there was warmth beneath the dry humor, enough that Eleanor found herself smiling back despite everything. "Why will you not simply tell me what they say about you?" she asked, more gently this time. "I would rather hear it plainly from you than gather it in frightened whispers from coachmen and innkeepers." Adrian set down his spoon, considering her for a long moment. "Because the moment I say the words aloud, you will begin watching me for proof of them, whether you intend to or not. I have watched it happen to every person who has ever heard the stories before meeting me properly. I find I would rather you know me a little longer first, if you are willing to grant me that." It was, Eleanor realized, the closest thing to a plea she had heard from him since the tavern, and something in his tired gray eyes made her willing to grant it, whatever caution told her about trusting a man whose own household staff seemed to fear him. "Very well," she said, "a little longer." The carriage passed through a small village, not an hour from the estate, and Eleanor watched, with growing unease, how the villagers reacted to the sight of the crest painted on the carriage door. Men touched their caps with stiff, hurried respect, their eyes lowered as though meeting the carriage's gaze directly might invite misfortune. An old woman selling apples at a roadside stall crossed herself exactly as the innkeeper's wife had done, murmuring something Eleanor could not hear, but understood instinctively was not a blessing. "They fear you," Eleanor said quietly, once the village had fallen behind them. "Not merely whisper about you, fear you, the way one fears a storm or a sickness." "Fear travels faster than truth ever does," Adrian said, his eyes fixed on the passing countryside rather than on her. "It has had 11 years to travel this particular road. I do not expect it to slow, simply because I have grown weary of outrunning it." "What happened 11 years ago?" He did not answer at once, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might retreat again behind his careful silence. But something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, as though the question, asked gently rather than demanded, cost him less than he expected. 11 years ago, I became Duke, a great deal sooner than anyone intended, myself least of all," he said. "The manner of that becoming is not a story I tell easily, nor to strangers in carriages, however patient they have proven themselves to be. Grant me a little more time, Eleanor, and I promise you will have the whole of it." She nodded, sensing the weight behind his careful words, and did not press further, though the shadow that crossed his face lingered with her long after the subject had changed. By the second evening, the carriage crested a hill, and below them, lit gold by the setting sun, stood a house so large it seemed to swallow the horizon. Gray stone towers rose against the darkening sky, and rows of dark windows watched their approach, like 100 unblinking eyes. Eleanor had grown up in a cottage, with 4 small rooms. She had never in her life seen a house meant to frighten those who looked upon it, and yet Blackmore Hall seemed built for exactly that purpose. "Welcome home," Adrian said quietly, and for the first time since she had met him, his voice carried something that was not quite confidence. It was almost, she thought, an apology. The great doors of Blackmore Hall opened before the carriage had fully stopped, and a line of servants formed at once along the front steps, silent and rigid as soldiers. At their head stood a tall woman in dark gray, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes sharp with the particular watchfulness of someone who had run a household for a very long time and trusted no one until they had earned it. "Mrs. Grady," Adrian said, helping Eleanor down from the carriage. "This is Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackmore." The words landed on Eleanor like cold water. Duchess. She had heard the coachman's whisper, but hearing the title spoken aloud, attached now to her own name, made the truth impossible to push aside any longer. Mrs. Grady's eyes moved over Eleanor, with quick, careful assessment, though her expression gave away nothing. "Your Grace," she said, with a curtsy so precise it seemed rehearsed for exactly this moment. "Welcome to Blackmore Hall." The staff echoed the greeting in a low murmur, and Eleanor felt every eye upon her, weighing her, wondering, perhaps, what kind of woman had managed to become a duchess in the space of 2 days. She managed a nod, grateful when Adrian's hand settled briefly at her back, guiding her up the steps before her legs could betray her nerves. Inside, the hall stretched upward into shadow, portraits lining the walls in heavy gilt frames, each face staring down with the same cold formality. Eleanor caught sight of one near the base of the staircase, a young man with familiar gray eyes and a smile far warmer than any she had yet seen on the living version of him. "My father," Adrian said, following her gaze. "He built most of this house. He also built most of its reputation, though I have done my share to add to it since." "What reputation is that, exactly?" Eleanor asked, tired of circling the question without ever receiving an answer. "Ask the servants," Adrian said, with a bitterness that surprised her. "They will tell you plenty, though I doubt you will hear the truth from any of them." He excused himself before she could press further, disappearing down a corridor with the swift retreat of a man who had perfected the art of avoiding conversations he did not wish to have. Eleanor took her first dinner alone that evening, seated at one end of a long polished table meant to seat 30 guests, with only the quiet clink of silver and the distant crackle of the fireplace for company. A footman named Peter served her with careful formality, and though the food was excellent, she found she had little appetite, her mind circling back again and again to the portrait of the smiling young man at the base of the staircase, and to the cold formality of the living man, who so clearly avoided his own memory of him. She thought of her grandfather's small kitchen table, of simple suppers eaten in comfortable silence, broken only by easy conversation, and felt, for the first time since arriving, the full weight of how far she had traveled from everything familiar. Blackmore Hall was beautiful in the way a winter morning is beautiful, all sharp edges and cold light, and Eleanor wondered, staring down the long empty length of the table, whether she would ever manage to feel at home within walls so clearly unaccustomed to warmth. It was Effie, clearing the plates later that evening, who first offered her a kindness that did not feel like careful performance. "It gets easier, Your Grace," the girl said quietly, "living in a house so big it swallows the sound of your own footsteps. I remember feeling near frightened of it myself, when I first came into service here. I promise you it grows smaller, in time, once you have found a few corners of it worth calling your own." Eleanor spent her first full day at Blackmore Hall, exploring its many rooms under Mrs. Grady's careful guidance, though the housekeeper's commentary remained strictly practical, pointing out which chimneys smoked in a west wind and which floorboards creaked loudly enough to wake the nursery above. There was a nursery, Eleanor noted, tucked away at the end of a quiet corridor, its shelves lined with toys that looked untouched in years, and she wondered, with a small ache she did not examine too closely, whether it had belonged to Adrian and his brother once, 2 boys, who had never imagined how differently their lives would unfold. The kitchens were warm and busy, run by a stout cook named Mrs. Poole, who eyed Eleanor with open curiosity, before deciding, apparently on the spot, that a duchess who complimented her bread honestly was a duchess worth trusting. The stables held a dozen fine horses, and Barnaby, who greeted her with the easy familiarity of a man who had already decided she was kinder than her circumstances suggested she ought to be. Everywhere Eleanor went, she found the same pattern repeating itself. Wariness at first, softening quickly into something like relief, as though the entire household had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to walk through its doors without judgment, already fixed in their expression. She found the long gallery on the second floor by accident, wandering a corridor she had not yet explored, and stopped short at the sight of dozens of Ashworth ancestors staring down from their gilded frames, generations of dukes and duchesses whose painted eyes seemed to track her progress across the polished floor. Near the end of the gallery hung a portrait considerably smaller and less formal than the rest. 2 young boys seated together beneath an old oak tree, one fair and laughing, the other darker and more serious, though even his painted expression held a warmth utterly absent from the man Eleanor had married. A small brass plate beneath the frame read simply, "The Young Lords of Blackmore, painted the summer before the elder's 16th birthday. Eleanor stood before it a long while, understanding, with sudden clarity, precisely how much joy had once lived in this house, before tragedy hollowed it out, and precisely how much Adrian must have lost, not only a brother, but the version of himself who had once sat laughing beneath that oak tree, without a single burden weighing on his shoulders. Eleanor did not have to wait long for answers. That evening, as a young maid named Effie helped her unpack the few belongings she had brought, the girl's tongue loosened with the easy chatter of someone unused to speaking with a duchess who did not scold her for it. "We none of us expected His Grace to marry again," Effie said, folding a shawl with careful hands. "Not after what happened with Lady Isabel." "Lady Isabel?" Effie's hands stilled, as though she had said too much. "His Grace's first betrothed, Your Grace." It ended badly. There was talk that he had ruined her reputation on purpose, out of spite, though nobody in this house believes that. And before that, there was the fire that took his brother, and some in the village still whisper His Grace had a hand in it, though I would stake my life it is not true. He is not a warm man, Your Grace. I will not pretend otherwise, but he is not a cruel one either. I have served him 3 years, and never once seen him raise his voice to a soul in this house. A broken engagement painted as cruelty, a brother's death painted as suspicion. The dreaded Duke, it seemed, might be less a monster, and more a man buried beneath the weight of rumors no one had ever bothered to question. "Thank you, Effie," she said quietly. "You may go." Later that same evening, Eleanor found Mrs. Grady in the linen room, folding sheets with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had never learned to sit idle. The housekeeper glanced up, and something in Eleanor's expression must have given away the questions crowding her mind, for Mrs. Grady set down her folding without being asked. "Effie has been talking," she said, not unkindly. "She told me about the fire, about Lady Isabel." Mrs. Grady sighed, lowering herself onto a nearby stool, as though the subject required more weight than she could manage standing. "I have served this family since His Grace was a boy, Your Grace, back when the old Duke still ran this house, and his 2 sons ran wild across these grounds together, thick as thieves. His Grace was never meant to inherit. He was the second son, free and easy, in a way his brother, the elder, never had the luxury of being. When the fire took the elder boy, it took something in His Grace too, something I do not believe has ever fully returned. He blamed himself for years, for being away that night, for being the one who lived, when duty said it should have been his brother left standing. And the rumors that he had a hand in it. Cruel and false, Mrs. Grady said firmly, spread by those who found it easier to imagine a villain than accept a simple, senseless tragedy. Grief makes people hungry for someone to blame, Your Grace. And His Grace was standing closest when the hunger struck. She resumed her folding, though her eyes remained thoughtful. He has not laughed in this house, not truly. In longer than I care to count. I heard him laugh 3 nights past, from the study. I confess, I nearly dropped my candle from the shock of it. Alone that night, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, and she wandered the unfamiliar corridors of Blackmore Hall, until she found Adrian in a small study, a single candle, burning low beside a stack of unopened letters. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his tired face. "You should be resting," he said. "I could not stop thinking," she admitted, taking a seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Effie told me about Lady Isabel. About your brother." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would send her away, as he had done in the carriage. Instead, he set down his pen, and something in his posture seemed to give way, like a wall finally allowing a single crack to show. "My brother died in a fire when I was 21, he said, his voice low and controlled, the way a man speaks when he has practiced not breaking. He was meant to inherit this house, not I. I was the second son, free to do as I pleased, and I pleased to travel, to study, to avoid every burden that came with this family's name. When he died, the burden fell to me, whether I wanted it or not, and there were those who found it convenient to whisper that I wanted it badly enough to arrange his death myself. That is monstrous," Eleanor said. "Surely no one who knew you believed such a thing." "Enough believed it to make it true in the only way that matters in society," he said. "And when I was later engaged to Isabel Caro, and she broke the engagement herself, for reasons that had nothing to do with me. Her family found it easier to claim I had wronged her than to admit the truth. It was simpler for everyone if I remained the villain. Villains make such convenient explanations for other people's failures. Eleanor thought of her cousin Gerald, who had spent years painting her as a burden rather than admit his own greed, and something in her chest ached with sudden understanding. "I know what it is to be misjudged by people who find it easier than the truth," she said softly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded passing behind his gray eyes. "You are the first person outside this house who has not flinched upon hearing any of it." "I have not finished hearing it," Eleanor said, with the ghost of a smile. "Perhaps I am simply saving my flinching for later." "You are either very brave or very foolish," Adrian said, though there was no unkindness in it. "My grandfather always said the two were closer cousins than most people like to admit." "He sounds as though he was a wise man." "He was a stubborn man," Eleanor said, which in my experience usually amounts to the same thing, provided the stubbornness is aimed in a decent direction. She glanced at the stack of unopened letters beside him. "You do not sleep much, do you?" "Sleep requires a mind willing to be quiet," Adrian said. "Mine rarely cooperates. Perhaps it might cooperate more easily if it were not spent guarding secrets from the one person in this house who has already decided not to judge you for them." He looked at her then with an expression she could not quite name, something caught between disbelief and cautious hope, as though he were unused to being offered patience rather than suspicion. "You say that so easily." "I say it because I mean it," Eleanor replied. "I did not marry you for your title, Your Grace. I did not even know I was marrying a duke until a coachman's slip of the tongue told me so. Whatever I decide to think of you, it will be built from what I see with my own eyes, not from what frightened servants whisper in corridors." For the first time since the tavern, he laughed, a low and startled sound, as though it had been dragged out of him against his will. It changed his whole face, softened the hard lines around his eyes, and Eleanor found herself smiling back before she could stop herself, aware, with a small and unwelcome jolt, that the dreaded Duke of Blackmore was becoming far less frightening to her with every passing hour, and far more difficult to keep at the safe distance she knew she ought to keep. 3 weeks passed at Blackmore Hall, and Eleanor found the rhythm of her new life settling around her in ways she had not expected. Mornings were spent walking the gardens with Mrs. Grady, who warmed to her slowly, but completely, once she understood that the new Duchess asked after the servants' families and remembered their names. Afternoons were spent in the library, where Adrian often worked among towers of correspondence, and where Eleanor discovered he kept a small collection of botanical drawings, delicate and precise, tucked away as though he were embarrassed by the gentleness of the hobby. "You drew these?" she asked one afternoon, holding up a sketch of a climbing rose, so detailed she could nearly smell it. "A habit from my traveling days," he admitted, not quite meeting her eyes. "Before I became the man everyone expects me to be." "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that the man who draws roses and the man everyone fears might simply be the same man, misunderstood by people who never troubled themselves to look closely." He did not answer, but he did not pull the sketch away from her either, and she counted that as a small victory. Eleanor began, in those weeks, to make small changes to the house, nothing grand enough to draw comment, but enough to soften its edges. She had fresh flowers cut for the hall each morning, encouraged Mrs. Poole to bake the seed cakes the younger staff so clearly loved but rarely received, and asked that the nursery be aired and dusted, though she said nothing to Adrian about why. He noticed anyway, one evening, standing in the doorway of the small room with an expression she could not read. "You have been in here," he said, not quite a question. "I hope you do not mind." It seemed a shame to let such a bright room sit closed and forgotten. He was quiet for a long moment, tracing his fingers along the edge of a small wooden horse left on the windowsill, clearly once beloved and long untouched. "This was my brother's," he said finally. "He carved it himself, badly, and was prouder of it than of anything else he ever made. I could not bring myself to move it after he died, and I could not bring myself to enter the room either, for a very long time." "I am sorry," Eleanor said softly. "I did not know." "I am not upset," he said, and seemed almost surprised by his own words. "I think, perhaps, it is time this room stopped being a tomb and became a nursery again, someday." I had simply never imagined someday arriving quite this quickly. The moment settled something between them, a quiet understanding that needed no further words, and Eleanor found herself, in the days that followed, thinking of that someday, far more often than she admitted aloud. One morning, Adrian surprised her by suggesting a ride across the eastern fields, and Eleanor, who had not sat a horse since her governess days ended, agreed with more eagerness than caution. They rode at an easy pace along the edge of the estate, the gray stone of Blackmore Hall shrinking behind them into something almost gentle in the morning light. "You ride well," Adrian observed, "for a woman who claims to have had little occasion for it." "I taught the daughters of a baronet for 2 years before my grandfather's health failed," Eleanor said. "Their mother insisted I learn alongside them, so I might supervise their lessons properly. I have not forgotten, apparently, though I suspect my form would horrify a true horsewoman." "Your form is fine," he said, and then, after a pause that seemed to cost him something, added, "I have not ridden this path since before my brother died. We used to race each other to the old oak at the field's edge, and he always won, though I have long suspected he simply rode a faster horse and never admitted it." "Do you miss him terribly?" "Every day," Adrian admitted, "though less sharply now than I once did. I used to believe the ache would simply flatten into nothing eventually, the way I was told grief always does. It has not flattened. It has only made room, slowly, for other things to sit beside it." He glanced at her, something unguarded in his expression. "You have made a great deal of room in this house, Eleanor, in a very short time." She did not know how to answer such a confession, so she simply nudged her horse forward, racing toward the old oak at the field's edge, and heard, behind her, the startled, delighted sound of Adrian's laughter as he spurred his own horse to follow. It was during one such quiet afternoon that Gerald Whitmore arrived at Blackmore Hall, uninvited and unannounced, his carriage rattling up the drive, with the particular arrogance of a man who believed he was owed an audience wherever he went. Eleanor felt her stomach drop the moment Mrs. Grady announced him. "Cousin," Gerald said, sweeping into the drawing room with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I could not let my dear Eleanor settle into such grand circumstances without paying my respects." "You have paid them," Eleanor said coolly. "You may go." Such hostility, for family. Gerald's gaze slid around the room, cataloging the silver, the paintings, the sheer weight of wealth surrounding him, and Eleanor recognized the look with a sinking feeling. He was not here for respects. He was here to see exactly what he had lost, and to decide whether there was still a way to take some of it for himself. Adrian entered a moment later, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. Gerald's easy confidence faltered only slightly, but he recovered quickly, extending a hand that Adrian did not take. "Your Grace," Gerald said, "I merely wish to congratulate my cousin on her sudden and rather convenient marriage." "You are welcome to your congratulations," Adrian said. "You are not welcome to remain long enough to deliver them." Gerald's smile thinned, but he did not leave without one final remark, tossed carelessly over his shoulder as he departed. "Do be careful, cousin. Grand houses have grand secrets, and I have heard this one holds more than most." After his carriage had disappeared down the drive, Mrs. Grady appeared quietly at Eleanor's side, having clearly overheard enough of the exchange through the half-open door to understand its weight. "Pay him no mind, Your Grace," she said firmly. "Men like your cousin thrive on planting doubt where none belongs. I have watched enough of them pass through this house over the years to know the type well, loud with threats and empty of any real courage to follow through on them." "I hope you are right," Eleanor said, though the unease Gerald had left behind lingered stubbornly in her chest. "I am rarely wrong about character, Your Grace, having spent 30 years judging it from a housekeeper's vantage point, which sees considerably more truth than any drawing room ever does." Mrs. Grady's expression softened. "You have brought more light into this house in a few short weeks than I have seen in it for the better part of a decade. Do not let a man like your cousin dim it so easily." The door closed behind him, and Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "He means to cause trouble," she said. "He always does when he cannot have what he wants outright." Adrian's expression had gone carefully blank again, the same wall she had seen the day the magistrate arrived. "Your cousin is not the only one circling this house with an interest in seeing our marriage fail," he said. "I have a cousin of my own, Edmund Vane." He stands to inherit this dukedom if I die without an heir, and he has made no secret, over the years, of his impatience for that day to arrive sooner rather than later. You think he had something to do with your brother's death, Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning. I have never been able to prove it, Adrian said, but I have never stopped believing it either. And now that word of our marriage has spread, and with it, the possibility of an heir who would remove him from the succession entirely, I expect Edmund will grow considerably more interested in us both. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hall around them. Then we are both being circled by wolves who call themselves family. It would seem so, Adrian said, and for the first time, he reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady, despite the coldness of his words. I did not intend to draw you into this danger, Eleanor. Our arrangement was meant to end in a single night. Our arrangement ended weeks ago, Eleanor said quietly, surprising herself with how easily the words came. What remains now is something else entirely, and I find I am not sorry for it. Adrian looked down at their joined hands, as though seeing them for the first time, and something in his careful composure finally, fully cracked. I have spent years making certain no one could get close enough to use me against myself, he said. I do not know how to protect a heart I did not intend to risk. Perhaps, Eleanor said softly, you simply protect it the way you protect everything else in this house, carefully, and without ever quite admitting you are doing it. He almost smiled, though worry still shadowed his eyes, and outside the tall windows of Blackmore Hall, storm clouds gathered over the hills, as though the sky itself understood that peace, however sweet, rarely lasts long when there are men in the world who profit from its ruin. It began, as such things often do, with a single careless remark at a card party in London, repeated by someone who had never met either Adrian or Eleanor, but found the story too delicious not to share further. By the time it reached its third and fourth tellings, the tale had grown claws. A governess with no fortune, some said, had heard whispers of a wealthy stranger traveling incognito through the countryside, and had staged an elaborate deception, complete with a conveniently dying grandfather, to trap him into marriage before he could learn her true intentions. The rumor reached London before Eleanor even knew it had been born. It arrived at Blackmore Hall in the form of a letter from Adrian's aunt, Lady Prescott, a sharp-tongued woman who had always shown Eleanor more kindness than most of society bothered to offer a duchess with no fortune of her own. The letter was blunt, as Lady Prescott's letters always were. They are saying you trapped him, my dear, that you invented a dying grandfather to force a hasty marriage and secure his fortune before he could think better of it. I do not believe a word of it, but I have heard it repeated in 3 drawing rooms this week alone, and the story grows crueler with each telling. You should know who carries tales fastest. It is always the person who benefits most from them spreading. Eleanor read the letter twice, her hands trembling with a fury she had not expected to feel so sharply. Edmund, she said, when she found Adrian in his study. Or Gerald, perhaps both, working together, each with something to gain if our marriage collapses under enough weight. Adrian read the letter in silence, his expression darkening with every line. This is precisely the sort of story that ruins a woman entirely. Whether or not a single word of it is true, society does not require proof, only entertainment. Then what do we do? We do not hide, Adrian said, and something in his voice had changed, a resolve Eleanor had not heard from him before. In all the weeks she had known him, he had spoken of his own ruined reputation, with weary resignation, a man who had long since stopped fighting for how the world saw him. But there was no resignation in his voice now. I have spent years allowing the ton to believe whatever cruelty amused them most about me. I did not fight because I did not believe I had anything left worth fighting for. I will not make that same mistake with you. In the days that followed, Eleanor watched the rumor take on a life of its own, growing crueler with every retelling, exactly as Lady Prescott had warned. A shopkeeper in the nearby village, ordinarily friendly, grew suddenly cool toward her during a visit for ribbon and thread. A letter arrived from a distant relation she had not heard from in years, dripping with false concern and thinly veiled curiosity about the true circumstances of her marriage. Even Effie, loyal as she was, reported overhearing 2 under-housemaids whispering by the linen cupboard, repeating a version of the story so twisted Eleanor barely recognized her own life within it. I did not think words could travel so quickly, nor grow so much uglier with each mile, Eleanor confessed to Adrian one evening, her composure finally cracking in the privacy of their shared sitting room. I begin to understand now why you stopped fighting the stories told about you. It is exhausting, simply existing beneath the weight of them. It is, Adrian agreed, taking her hands in his. Which is precisely why I do not intend to let you carry that weight, the way I once carried mine, alone and unanswered for years. I built my silence out of exhaustion, and told myself it was dignity. I will not let you make the same mistake. Lady Prescott arrived 2 days before the dinner, declaring loudly upon entering that she had no intention of watching her nephew's happiness be dismantled by idle gossip without lending whatever assistance she could offer. She spent an entire afternoon with Eleanor, going over the guest list, marking names with sharp, decisive strokes of her pen. This one gossips but means no true harm. This one will believe whatever flatters her own opinion of herself. And this one, she said, tapping Edmund Vane's name with unmistakable distaste, will smile at you all evening, while quietly hoping you choke on the soup. Do not let him see you flinch, whatever he says. I do not intend to flinch at all, Eleanor said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. Good girl, Lady Prescott said approvingly. Adrian has spent too many years believing silence was the only dignified response to cruelty. It is well past time someone taught him otherwise, and I confess, I am delighted it turned out to be you. He arranged, within the week, a grand dinner at Blackmore Hall, inviting every family whose opinion carried weight in London society, including, deliberately, both Gerald Whitmore and Edmund Vane. Eleanor did not understand the strategy until the evening itself, when Adrian stood before the assembled guests and spoke with a clarity and warmth she had never seen him show a room full of strangers. The guests arrived in a steady stream of carriages through the late afternoon, and Eleanor greeted each one at Adrian's side, her practiced smile hiding a stomach twisted tight with nerves. She recognized several faces from the earlier dinner, though their expressions now carried a curious, assessing quality she had not felt before, as though each guest had come as much to study the accused as to enjoy the meal. Gerald arrived looking uncomfortable in borrowed finery, clearly uncertain why he had been invited at all, while Edmund Vane swept in with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, kissing Eleanor's hand with a courtesy so smooth it made her skin crawl. Charming gathering, cousin, Edmund said to Adrian, glancing around the grand dining hall with open appraisal. One might almost believe you have something to prove. I have nothing to prove, Adrian replied evenly. I have simply grown tired of allowing others to write my story without my input. Tonight, I intend to correct that. Edmund's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, and Eleanor felt, watching the exchange, the first true confirmation that Edmund understood exactly what kind of evening awaited him. Dinner proceeded through its many courses with the strained politeness of a room full of people pretending not to watch one another too closely, and it was only once the final course had been cleared that Adrian rose from his seat, tapping his glass gently for attention. Many of you have heard stories about my marriage, he said, his eyes moving over the gathered faces without flinching. That my wife trapped me, that I was too foolish, or too desperate, to see a scheme laid plainly before me. I would like to correct the record, since it seems no one else intends to do so honestly. He turned to Eleanor, and the room quieted to catch every word. My wife married a stranger, to grant a dying man peace, expecting nothing in return but the chance to bury her grandfather with a clear conscience. She did not know my name. She did not know my title. She asked for nothing beyond what our bargain required, and she has asked for nothing since. If there is a scheme in this house, I invite whoever authored the rumor to stand and explain it to my face, rather than whispering it in rooms I do not attend. Silence spread through the hall, broken only by the nervous shifting of guests unused to such directness. Eleanor watched Edmund Vane's composure falter for just a moment, a flicker of alarm crossing his sharp features before he schooled it back into polite indifference. Gerald, for his part, looked as though he wished the floor might open beneath him. It was Lady Prescott who broke the silence, raising her glass with theatrical flourish. Well said, nephew. I have always thought half the ton would rather believe a cruel story than a kind one, simply because cruelty requires less imagination. A ripple of laughter followed, tension easing just enough for the evening to continue, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since the letter had arrived, that the tide might actually be turning in their favor. Edmund approached Eleanor later that evening, once the other guests had drifted into smaller conversations, his smile smooth and his eyes cold as winter glass. "A masterful performance," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "You have taught my cousin well." I did not think him capable of speaking so passionately for anyone but himself. "He does not need teaching," Eleanor said, holding his gaze without flinching. "He needed only someone willing to stand beside him while he found his courage. I imagine that is not a gift you have ever offered him." Something flickered behind Edmund's composed features, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Be careful, Your Grace. Houses like this one have a way of punishing those who grow too comfortable inside them." "Is that a warning, Mr. Vane, or a confession?" He said nothing further, only inclined his head with exaggerated courtesy and moved away into the crowd. But Eleanor felt the chill of the exchange settle into her bones, long after he had gone, certain now that whatever role Edmund had played in spreading the cruel rumor, his ambitions ran deeper and darker than mere gossip. Later that night, after the last carriage had rattled away down the drive, Eleanor found Adrian standing alone on the terrace, looking out over the dark gardens.
"You did not have to defend me so publicly," she said, joining him at the railing.
"You could have let the rumor die on its own." "Rumors do not die on their own," he said. "I learned that lesson too late, after my brother's death, after Isabel. I let both stories grow unchallenged, because I believed fighting them would only give them more life. I was wrong. Silence is not dignity. It is simply surrender dressed in better clothes." He turned to face her fully, the moonlight softening the hard lines of his face into something almost vulnerable. "I could not surrender you the way I surrendered myself, Eleanor. I find I do not know how to lose you without losing something I am not willing to give up." Eleanor's heart climbed into her throat. "Adrian, let me finish, before my nerve fails me as thoroughly as it failed me the day I agreed to your bargain in that tavern." He took her hands in his grip steady, despite the rawness in his voice. "I did not intend to fall in love with the woman who hired me for a single night's performance, but I have. Every day since, I have. And I do not care any longer who calls me dreaded, so long as you do not." "I never called you dreaded," Eleanor whispered. "Not once. Not from the very first night." "No," he agreed, drawing her closer. "You called me kind. I have spent years forgetting such a thing was possible for a man like me. I do not intend to forget it again." The storm that had been building over Blackmore Hall for weeks finally broke that night, rain lashing against the terrace doors, but neither Eleanor nor Adrian moved to escape it, standing together in the doorway, as though the danger circling them from Edmund Vane and Gerald Whitmore alike had, for one brief and perfect moment, ceased to matter at all. It would matter again soon enough, but for tonight, it was enough to simply not be afraid. The letter arrived 3 days after the dinner, delivered not to Blackmore Hall, but to Lady Prescott in London, who recognized the handwriting at once and rode through the night to bring it herself. Eleanor was in the garden when the carriage arrived, and one look at Lady Prescott's face told her the peace of the last few days had come to an end. "I found this among my late husband's papers," Lady Prescott said, pressing a folded letter into Adrian's hands the moment he joined them. "He served as a magistrate near your family's estate the year your brother died. I never thought to look through his old files until your rumor reached my ears and reminded me how rarely truth and gossip walk the same road." Adrian unfolded the letter with hands that were not quite steady, and Eleanor watched the color drain from his face as he read. "This is a statement," he said slowly, "from a stable hand who witnessed the fire the night my brother died. He claims he saw a figure near the stable doors before the flames began, a figure he recognized." "Edmund," Eleanor breathed. "The statement was never entered into any official record," Lady Prescott said grimly. "My husband noted in his own hand that the family paid to have the matter quietly dropped, though he does not say which family, or why. I suspect now that someone with considerable means made certain the truth stayed buried alongside your brother." Adrian's jaw tightened with a fury Eleanor had never seen in him before, cold and controlled, and far more frightening than any rumor the Ton had ever whispered about him. "Edmund has spent 11 years allowing me to be suspected of a crime he committed himself, patient enough to wait for the dukedom to fall into his hands through my death, rather than force the issue directly. He miscalculated only one thing. "What is that?" Eleanor asked. "That I would ever find a reason strong enough to fight for what remained of my own name," Adrian said, and looked at her with such open feeling that her breath caught in her throat. That night, Adrian sat with the letter for hours, and Eleanor found him still awake near dawn, the paper worn soft at its folds from repeated reading. "I could let this rest," he admitted quietly, when she sat beside him. "Edmund has done enough damage without my inviting a scandal that will drag my brother's memory through every drawing room in London a second time. Some nights, I still believe silence is the safer road." "And other nights?" Eleanor asked. "Other nights, I remember that silence did not protect me from suspicion. It merely left the truth undefended and allowed a guilty man to profit from my restraint for 11 years running." He folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "My brother deserves better than a second silence. And you deserve a husband willing to fight for the name you now share, rather than one who simply endures whatever is said of it." "Then fight," Eleanor said simply, taking his hand. "Whatever comes of it, I would rather stand beside the truth than hide behind another comfortable lie." Adrian brought the statement before the full authority of the county magistrate within the week, alongside testimony gathered quietly from 2 former stable hands who had long ago left Edmund's employ under circumstances that now looked considerably less innocent. Edmund Vane was summoned to answer for himself, and though he arrived at the hearing with his usual cold composure, it did not survive contact with the evidence laid plainly before the room. The county hall was packed with spectators the morning of the hearing, word having spread quickly through the surrounding villages that the Duke of Blackmore intended to finally answer, publicly and directly, the questions that had followed him for over a decade. Eleanor felt every eye in the room settle upon them as they entered, a mixture of curiosity and lingering suspicion that made her chin lift a little higher, determined not to let a single flicker of doubt show on her face, whatever nerves twisted beneath it. Eleanor sat beside Adrian throughout the hearing, watching Edmund's carefully constructed composure fray thread by thread. He claimed at first that the stable hand's statement was the fabrication of a disgruntled former servant, dismissed years ago for theft and eager for revenge. But the magistrate had done his own quiet investigation in the days before the hearing, and 2 more witnesses came forward, servants who had left Edmund's household under circumstances that now looked considerably less innocent than they had seemed at the time. One recalled Edmund's insistence, the very night of the fire, that the stables be searched thoroughly for evidence of an accident before anyone thought to summon help for the family inside the burning house. Another recalled money changing hands shortly after, quiet payments that had never been explained. He did not confess outright. Men like Edmund rarely do. But his story faltered under questioning, contradicted itself in small and telling ways, and by the time the hearing concluded, whatever remained of his standing in society had crumbled entirely. He would face no formal charge for a crime, 11 years buried, and impossible now to fully prove. But the whispers that had once painted Adrian as a monster turned, at last, toward the man who had actually earned them. A letter arrived unexpectedly from Isabel Caro herself, now married to a quiet gentleman farmer and living far from London's sharper tongues. She had heard, even at such a distance, of the hearing and its outcome, and wrote to offer, at last, the truth she had never spoken aloud. Her family, she confessed, had pressured her to break the engagement quietly after learning of a private scandal involving her own younger brother, and rather than risk that truth becoming public, they had allowed society to believe Adrian the villain instead, a reputation he already carried and could, they reasoned cruelly, better afford to bear. She apologized for her silence, explaining she had been young and frightened and unwilling to defy a family determined to protect itself at his expense. Adrian read the letter twice, then set it carefully aside, and told Eleanor later that evening that he felt, for the first time in over a decade, entirely unburdened of a lie he had carried so long he had nearly forgotten it was not his own to carry. Gerald Whitmore, watching his ally's downfall from a careful distance, wisely chose to abandon whatever scheme he had been nursing against Eleanor's inheritance. He did not apologize, and Eleanor did not expect him to, but he also did not trouble Blackmore Hall again, content to let his cousin's unexpected happiness remain someone else's concern entirely. In the quiet days following the hearing, Adrian visited his brother's grave for the first time in years, and Eleanor walked with him in silence, understanding instinctively that some griefs required company rather than conversation. He knelt beside the simple stone marker for a long while, and when he finally rose, something in his shoulders had eased that had been tight and guarded since the very first night she met him. "I used to visit only when the guilt grew too heavy to carry alone," he admitted, as they walked back toward the house. "I could never stay long. It felt too much like standing before a judge who had already condemned me. Today it felt different. Today it simply felt like visiting my brother." "Perhaps that is what grief becomes," Eleanor said gently, "once the lies built around it are finally cleared away. Simply grief again, instead of a burden dressed up as guilt." Society, fickle as ever, began to whisper a different story after that. Not of a duke who had murdered his own brother, but of a man who had spent 11 years wrongly accused, patient and dignified through every cruel rumor, until love finally gave him the courage to demand the truth be told. Eleanor found she did not mind this new story nearly as much as the old one, though she privately thought the truest version was simpler than anything the tongue could invent. He had never needed courage to love her. He had needed only permission to believe he deserved it. On a bright morning some weeks later, standing together in the garden, where the climbing roses from his old sketches had finally begun to bloom, Adrian took her hands in his. No vicar present this time, no urgency of a dying man's wish, no bargain to be struck. "I once told you our arrangement would end completely, when the performance was finished," he said. "I find I owe you an apology. I never intended it to become the truest thing I have ever done." "You owe me nothing," Eleanor said, smiling up at him, with a warmth that no longer needed to guard itself against fear. "You already gave me everything I never knew I was hoping for. A home, a family, a husband who turned out to be nothing at all like the dreaded Duke the whole of England feared." "And what is he like instead?" Adrian asked, drawing her close. "Kind," Eleanor said simply, "just as I told him, the very first night I met him, in a smoke-filled tavern, over a bargain neither of us expected to change our lives so completely." Above them, the sky over Blackmore Hall was clear and blue for the first time in weeks, and the house that had once seemed built to frighten those who looked upon it now simply looked, to anyone passing by, like exactly what it had quietly become, a home. A year passed, and Blackmore Hall no longer felt like the cold and watchful house Eleanor had first entered, with fear pressed tight against her ribs. The portraits still lined the great staircase, but new ones had joined them, painted at Lady Prescott's insistence, one of Eleanor in the garden among the climbing roses, and one of Adrian, with a rare, unguarded smile that the artist had captured almost by accident, catching him in a moment when he thought no one important was watching. Eleanor often thought back to the desperate young woman who had counted coins in a smoke-filled tavern, certain she was making the greatest gamble of her life for one single night of pretending. She had been right, though not in the way she expected. It had been the greatest gamble of her life. She simply had not understood, not then, that it would never truly end. News arrived that spring that Eleanor was carrying their first child, and the household erupted into a quiet, disbelieving joy that seemed to soften even the ancient stones of the hall itself. Mrs. Grady wept openly, something none of the staff had ever witnessed from her before, and Effie could not stop smiling for a full week. Certain, she confided to anyone who would listen, that a house so long shadowed by grief deserved every bit of the happiness now finding its way back into its halls. On the anniversary of that strange first bargain, Adrian surprised Eleanor with a quiet dinner, set not in the great dining hall, but in the small study where they had first spoken honestly to one another. The botanical sketches now framed and hung proudly along the walls, instead of hidden away in embarrassment. He had asked Mrs. Poole to prepare a simple stew, nothing grand, and Eleanor recognized it at once as an echo of the humble supper they had shared at that roadside inn during their journey to Blackmore Hall. "You remembered," she said, touched beyond words. "I remember every detail of that week," Adrian said, "though I confess I did not understand, at the time, how completely it would rearrange the whole of my life. I walked into a tavern that night, expecting nothing more than a quiet drink and an early night. I walked out with a wife, a title returned to its rightful dignity, and a heart I had long since given up hoping anyone would want to claim. I am glad I asked," Eleanor said softly. "So am I," Adrian replied, raising his glass to hers, more grateful than any dreaded duke has any right to be. Edmund Vane's name was rarely spoken again, his reputation too damaged to secure him welcome in any respectable drawing room, and he retreated eventually to the continent, where his schemes, whatever new ones he devised, no longer touched the lives of the people he had once tried to destroy. Gerald sent a stiff, formal letter of congratulations upon news of the coming child, more concerned, Eleanor suspected, with maintaining some thin thread of family connection to a duchess than with any genuine goodwill, but she chose to answer it kindly regardless. She had learned, in the years since her grandfather's death, that peace was worth more than old grievances, and that the truest revenge against a man like Gerald was simply to be happy in a life he had once tried to take from her. Adrian changed too, in ways so gradual, Eleanor almost did not notice them until they had fully taken root. The wariness that had once shadowed every conversation slowly gave way to an ease she had not thought him capable of when they first met. He laughed more freely now, teased Mrs. Grady about her strictness with the younger staff, and spent long afternoons in the garden with Eleanor, rather than buried behind his study door with letters he no longer needed to hide. "I used to believe love was a debt collected by people determined to see me suffer for it eventually," he confessed to her one evening, his hand resting gently against the small swell of her stomach. "My brother's death taught me that. Isabel taught me that. I built this entire house into a fortress against ever needing anyone again." "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Now I think love was simply waiting for the right person to knock on the door of a fortress and refuse to be turned away," he said, even when the man behind it gave her every reason to leave. "I nearly did leave," Eleanor admitted, smiling. "That first night in the carriage, when you would not tell me your name, I very nearly demanded you turn the horses around. I am endlessly grateful you did not." "So am I," she said, and meant it with the whole of her heart. Their daughter was born on a clear autumn morning, with her mother's warm brown eyes, and, everyone agreed, her father's stubborn chin. They named her Grace, a small joke between them that only the two of them fully understood, a nod to the title neither of them had asked for, and both had come, in time, to wear with a warmth that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with love, freely given. Little Grace was christened on a bright winter morning in the same small village church where Eleanor and Adrian had first spoken their vows before her dying grandfather, a choice Eleanor had insisted upon despite the grander cathedrals available to a duke's family. Mr. Pemberton, older now and slower in his step, performed the ceremony with visible pride, remarking afterward that he had never in all his years of service seen a marriage begun so strangely bloom into something so complete. Lady Prescott stood as godmother, declaring loudly to anyone who would listen that she had known from the very first dinner party that Eleanor possessed exactly the steel required to manage a Blackmore properly, and Mrs. Grady wept again, unashamed this time, cradling the infant with the practiced ease of a woman who had waited a very long time for a nursery to be filled with something other than dust and old grief. Even Barnaby made the long drive from the stables to the church, standing quietly at the back among the household staff, and when Eleanor caught his eye during the small celebration that followed, he simply nodded, as though confirming, at last, that the frightened whispers of that first carriage ride had been entirely, wonderfully wrong. The story of the dreaded Duke of Blackmore still occasionally surfaced in London drawing rooms, told now by strangers who had never met him, embellished and softened depending on who told it and why. But those who actually knew Adrian and Eleanor Ashworth understood the truth was simpler than any story the tongue could invent. A desperate young woman had once hired a stranger for a single night, never imagining he would become the truest partner of her life. A guarded man had once believed himself unworthy of love, never imagining a stranger's bargain would teach him otherwise. Blackmore Hall stood as it always had, gray stone against gray sky, towers rising toward the horizon. But those who visited now no longer spoke of it with dread. They spoke of the roses blooming along its garden walls, of the laughter that drifted from its open windows on warm afternoons, and of the Duke and Duchess who had turned a house once feared throughout England into the very thing it had always been meant to be. A home, built not on titles or fortune, but on the quiet, unshakable truth that even the most dreaded of men can be saved by someone brave enough to see past the rumors, and patient enough to wait for the truth to bloom.